German illustrator, designer and artist Julius Diez was born in Nuremberg in 1870, the son of a prosperous merchant. And with an obvious talent for visual expression in childhood, he later went on to study at both the Munich School of Applied Arts and the Munich Art Academy. I've been unable to discover how old he was when he graduated from his studies, but the earliest example of published work I found came from an 1895 edition of Martin Gerlach's Allegorien series. This highly respected annual portfolio featured the work of a select group of German artists, illustrators and designers, and appearing in this series at the age of only 25 was a clear indication that he had already acquired enough of a reputation to be considered as one of Gerlach's chosen few. And he had more similarly fanciful neoclassically styled images published in the editions of Allegorien that followed over the next few years. But in 1896 he was also offered a full-time position as a staff artist with the recently established but instantly influential and successful magazine Jugend, which became a greatly admired vehicle for both written and drawn creative expression, and consequently raised the public profile of all who contributed to it considerably. The earliest examples of images created by Diez for the magazine demonstrated quite clearly that he was an individual who strongly resisted the notion of being stylistically stereotyped. Not only did he employ a range of graphic techniques and mediums in the production of his illustrations, but he also proved himself equally capable of success with more serious-minded or romantic material featuring broadly representational figure work through to varying degrees of comic styling. These early contributions to Jugend were printed either in monochrome or with a two-colour limited palette, but the qualities inherent in all the engrossing images he created more than made up for the absence of full colour. In 1898, in addition to his actual magazine work, he was chosen to design a medievally styled pack of playing cards published by Jugend as a promotional bonus for their subscribers, and they proved to be particularly popular and successful in their mission. All the images were created by Diez in pen and ink and had a limited palette of flat colours added at print, but they were deliberately styled to resemble early woodcuts. The various characters portrayed were darkly humorous and grotesque, and were possessed of a medieval authority in both their anatomy and their bold stylistic execution. And unusually, it wasn't just the expected face cards which were illustrated. Even the numerical cards in this pack featured smaller monochrome scenarios for good measure. Although in supposedly full-time employment with Jugend, a year later he also created this somewhat atypical but powerful lithographic colour poster for Pelican Art Materials as an additional freelance commission. Nevertheless, the great majority of his images were created for his employers, even if he obviously had their approval to work for other clients. And as he had already established, he could turn his hand from the grotesquely funny to finely delineated neoclassical aesthetic beauty and more brutalist Germanic pastiches of woodcut styling similar to the playing cards apparently with ease, and always with empathy for the text the images accompanied. And as the new century began, he also started having images reproduced in full colour from his original more expressionistic paintings too, and was no longer limited to monochrome or spot colours, even if he happily continued to work in those formats. Frequently this time his illustrations would appear several times within the same issue, each one different from the last and successful on its own merits. Diez was by this time an integral part of the magazine's unprecedented success, and his images featured regularly on the covers, and they too were never less than eye-catching and on occasion somewhat strange and obtuse in terms of their subject matter. With his position at Jugend completely secure, Diez also continued to work with his employer's blessing in other areas of expression in the early years of the decade. He had success as a designer of ceramics and furniture, and even took commissions to decorate the exteriors of civic buildings such as the Bavarian National Museum in Munich, which unfortunately was later demolished. In 1902 he ventured into children's illustration with the picture book Meow Lena, which was another departure both stylistically and in terms of the child-friendly content, an aspect not previously seen in his output. These images were created by Diez in line only with pen and ink, and the various colours were added at printing in multiple print runs, with visually appealing and quite modernist results. But despite the obviously considerable time and energy he devoted to these extracurricular activities, Jugend remained the primary showcase for his commitment to graphic versatility, which if anything became even more pronounced, with a series of remarkably diverse illustrations which few others could hope to emulate. Full colour, limited palettes of spot colour, and line-only monochromes all proliferated at this time. And despite the fierce competition from his large number of talented colleagues, Diez justifiably remained one of the most popular and respected of their contributors, not least for his remarkable versatility and persistence of his visual imagination. In 1904 he returned to children's book illustration with an edition of Sleeping Beauty. This book features some evocative brooding landscape illustration, along with more figure-based imagery, all of which was created in a blend of Gothic and comic book styling. I don't know whether it was or was not commercially successful, but for whatever reason this second venture into children's illustration seems to have also been his last. And it seems a pity he didn't create more along similar lines. Diez's contributions to Jugend continued undiminished, and he was producing a significant number of wildly varied images on an impossibly prodigious level, all of which continue to roam freely between broad satire to more serious fantasy subjects, and sometimes combining both elements printed in various levels of colour. How he found time to also design this pair of impressive mosaics for Nuremberg railway station in 1906, I can't imagine, or for that matter this stained glass design a year later. But it was also in 1907 that he first embarked on one of the most significant and enduring projects of his career. This was the design of a series of Greek god-themed images which were reproduced as large-scale mosaics, incorporated into the foyer of the Kurhaus building in Wiesbaden. The scale of this project meant that although it began in 1907, it wasn't actually completed until 4 years later, although following the creation of the initial designs, Diez's commission would have been much less. The impressive neoclassical processional imagery he created was translated with great success into mosaic by skilled craftsmen, and their dominant awe-inspiring presence in this grand building, now used as a conference centre, greatly enhanced his already enviable reputation as one of Germany's finest visual creatives. And just like his other commitments, this work was undertaken in addition to, rather than instead of, his supposedly full-time job at Jugend. Even as he had worked on this civic undertaking in 1908, his success in all creative ventures led to him also being appointed as a professor at the Munich School of Applied Arts. So, at this point, he was holding down two supposedly full-time jobs in addition to his other art, design and illustration projects. In 1910, in his role as an academic, he published a book featuring a large volume of mostly monochrome graphic devices under the collective title Vignetten. The images were intended to be instructional, serving as examples of good practice to students embarking on a career in graphics. By this point, quite a lot of Diez's illustrations for Jugend were also being printed using full-colour lithography, and he took advantage of this to use the magazine as a platform for his painted work. And although posters were never high on Diez's list of priorities, he continued to design a few around this time, which were predominantly produced with his more graphically formal decorative approach. But when war was declared in 1914, he immediately began to harness his graphic talents to create propaganda in support of the fatherland, printed primarily in monochrome only. And despite Jugend's original status and mission as an arts magazine, its editorial policy was now one of unquestioning support for the Kaiser and the German armed forces. And like many of his colleagues working for the magazine, Diez didn't just create what might be broadly considered patriotic imagery, but contributed a large volume of images condemning the Allies and their leaders, and his illustrations were certainly among the most prolific and vitriolic. All of them explored the darker side of his creative expression, which had always been a significant factor in his work. And his vilifications of the Allies incorporated some nightmarish fantasy creations to significantly disturbing effect. John Bull, Britain's personified icon, came in for some particularly rough handling by Diez, either as a monster worthy of Dürer's Armageddon prints or as a more demonic figure cruelly manipulating other countries to stand against a Germany portrayed as the valiant victim of his aggression. The specific meaning of these images may have become clouded to all but the most diligent historians, but nevertheless the underlying message remains clear as day even now. Diez had never really been an illustrator who anyone would associate with jolliness or frivolity in his work, but these images were about as dark as could be, and obviously heartfelt expressions of his own perceptions of the war. Nevertheless, there were also a couple of examples of his work for Jugend which also evoked the misery and futility of war in more roundabout ways, and there were even a few illustrations which ignored the conflict altogether in favour of his more usual fantasy-themed imagery. But they were relatively few and far between, and he didn't stop creating his more nightmarish visions until the war ended with Germany's defeat and surrender in 1918. At which point Diez returned immediately to the more allegorical decorative side of his creativity, although he did create this defiant image of a German phoenix rising from the ashes of defeat, which of course later turned out to be horribly prophetic. But in terms of both subject matter and stylistically, it was as if wartime Diez had never existed, and the harsh angular graphic styling he had used in the previous 4 years was gone, in favour of more painterly expressionistic images. It's probably not coincidental that Diez was working more as an artist by this point, and as well as a series of engrossing etchings, he painted his allegorical and mythologically based subjects in oils on canvas for exhibition and sales to collectors. All evidence of commercial work became conspicuously thin on the ground around the middle of the 1920s, although he did design a few more posters, and he continued to produce illustrations for Jugend, even if at nothing like the same level of productivity as previously. Some of the examples he created at this time indicated a brief dalliance with the Art Deco styling, which had begun to dominate German illustration, as it had in the rest of Europe. But it appears to have not led him in any new direction. In 1925 he took another teaching post, this time at the Munich Academy, and although the source doesn't make it clear, I can only imagine that this was instead of rather than as well as his other academic position. Whatever his employment and self-employment status was by this point, I have no firm idea, but there was only a minimal amount of his work published in Jugend up to the 1930s. And in 1931 he created this absorbing fantasy painting. But the evidence, or rather lack of it, clearly indicates he was almost certainly no longer employed by the magazine. And his work was completely absent from Jugend up to the outbreak of World War II in 1939, when a couple of illustrations he had created decades earlier were reprinted on the cover as propaganda for the Third Reich. And Julius Diez died in 1957 when he was 87 years old. What he had done in his later years isn't recorded, although I did find out he was still active as a painter in 1939, when he had the somewhat dubious honour of having this painting bought by a certain Mr. Hitler, who admired it greatly. But I didn't find a single other piece of visual evidence from any of his creative endeavours in art, design or illustration. It's a guess on my part, but I think it's quite likely that after a career of such incredible productivity and popular success, he probably decided to retire sometime in the later 1930s, and settled for creating the odd painting and even seeing out his days as an academic for a little longer. But in the absence of any more information about his life and work, the best I can do yet again is to conclude with a few more examples of the formidable graphic talents of Julius Diez for your appreciation.